Let's talk about ancient mummies. So let's go back in time to ancient Egypt. All the way back to ancient Egypt. And let's look at the mummification process. The first mummies were natural mummies. They weren't run through the Natron process. They were actually just naturally desiccated. The oldest mummies recovered to date from the Old Kingdom, though Egyptologists believe that mummification was in use much earlier than that, and are probably out up under the dunes. At first, the body was mummified through environmental desiccation by leveraging the dryness of the environment and the heat of the climate and letting sand naturally dehydrate someone out. Early experimentations in mummification like this were conducted with the use of resins made from tree saps, and they've tested that out and find that that was from European conifer or pine tree saps mixed with bitumen. Strips of linen were only used in some superficial parts of the epidermis or the skin of the hands, or wrapping around the jaw, usually keeping the mouth closed and not in a gape situation. And it developed from there. This is known as Ginger. He's a blonde-haired Ghibelline mummy from proto-pre-dynastic Egypt. Here is something recreating what it would have somewhat looked like in his tomb at the time. His skin color naturally would have been like the lightest colors that you see in here, and the rest of it is stained and burnt, for he pretty much really got desiccated like a piece of beef jerky. And that he even happens worse whenever they do it with natron, which darkens it very much, like you see on his rump. The earliest of pottery that are right up over his shoulder I've shown in recent videos, as far as the origins of Isis, symbology that's shown on that, but all the way back to cave walls dating 10,000 BC and past, showing the exact same iconography and where it had come from and the people that made up the early Badarian culture. But this is a first mummification type process, kind of natural. Osiris has a lot to do with this. In fact, he's actually the first mummy, if you will, and the first one that was put back together, and the first ideal of somebody that's being able to be resurrected. And the concept is that he was and he did. Just like we believe in Jesus Christ doing the same thing. Dumuzi over in the Sumerians and others. Ideologically, the will to preserve the body is not explained in any way until about 3600 BC, because we don't really have writings. This is when the Egyptian belief that the body housed the soul was finally documented for modern Egyptologists to eventually decipher. But as I've shown in a lot of my work, that concept goes back far, far, and in fact the idea of them having the vulture on the headdress comes from a time way back when, and associates that same statured people doing the Isis pose in a time where they used to put a body up on a dais and let the birds take him up into heaven. It was not until the arrival of the myth of Osiris in the Egyptian religion, which came in about the 5th dynasty, that the mummification was thoroughly conceptualized. The practice was thereafter grounded in both a mythological and ideological point of view, and an idea that this king had to live forever and go on, like we said here. In fact, here's his name highlighted in quite a few places. Their Genesis myth of the first mummy. Osiris was mainly known as the god of the dead, or he became known as that because he was the god of resurrection and had died. And so he was one, along with Anubis and a few others. They're always there to greet you because they were already people that were deified from the past, and so they would have been where you were going. The most well-known Genesis myth concerning Osiris is that of his dismemberment. Many of y'all have probably heard the story where he gets cut apart into 12 pieces and so on, and then he gets put back together. There's actually a few different myths on that. One of them is actually he gets into a boat or sarcophagus that's basically like a boat, or something that you would think of Sargon the Great had done, or Moses in a basket, or Deucalion, but instead it's him, and he went down the Nile and ended up floating and getting caught up in a tree, and the tree grew around him. And this is an ancient Lebanon area, and making connections to that too. And I've done that in a recent video. There's no need to really go into that concept. But the other one, they put him back together, but the only thing they couldn't find was his male member was eaten by a fish, or Oxyrhynchus type of fish. And therefore, really what we're looking at is the idea of a virgin birth, because they recreated it out of gold. You see the helmets that they use in different ways. There are ram's horns on the one on the right, which have been more like a canoe type bows. You can't quite see the top of Osiris's here, but you can see the one on the bottom, and it looks like a bowling pin. I just did a video about bowling and how it seems to have come from a bowling type game that the Egyptians had with bowling pins. In fact, that headdress there is a bowling pin. Look at it. Look at it whenever you see it over and over again. And then that is used as a bat, and eventually in jugglers and so on, all through the Middle Ages, and jokers and jesters. But then we have it come all the way down. Jugglers still use this type thing, but then you say they're juggling bowling pins, but that's also a bat. Our bat nowadays doesn't have that arched end on the end of it. It's flat, and it comes out, and it's longer and so on, but make no bones about it, that was the original bat used for ball games. So the myth of Osiris, Set, and Iset, the first mummy. It was Plutarch who gives the most simplified and complete summary of the story. Within Egyptian mythology, Osiris represented the first king to rule Egypt in the Wayback Machine. So whenever they try to make that connective, people say, well, then that's Narmer. Well, there's also a Menes too. Oh, that's a mythological idea like Osiris too. So those are people that come before, but there are 3 or 4 societies that have a Men that starts it off. Minoans, for one, but Narmer is the person who started it off, or it's the Narmer palette that we have that's supposed to be the connective in both types. Here's that bowling pin hat again. And the Cobra Uraeus. Within Egyptian mythology, Osiris represented the first king to rule Egypt, and jealous of his power, his brother Seth attempted to usurp the throne. After several unsuccessful attempts, Seth succeeded in killing his brother by dismembering him and scattering the pieces of his body all over Egypt. Now, this is a strange thing here, but in this telling, it's what I've said before too. There's first dynasty and then second dynasty, and how it went down looks like it was pulled into a myth by about the 5th dynasty, and we're talking about, and Set Peribsen, what looks like that's the original Seth that goes on, but it also looks like that was already established somehow before that, And so there was a person in the Wayback Machine, perhaps in the Dakota culture, Badarians and so on, or even far back before that, that connected these people to this idea. Seth is a known redhead, and Sethites, Seti, and so on are connected to those, and also his son Ramses, who's a known redheaded person, so that goes with it. But Rams with Aries makes sense too. So he dismembered his body, and Iset, the great queen of magic, notice it's not Isis, it's Iset, which goes with Set, traveled all over Egypt in search of the pieces of her husband's body. After long search, she recovered all the pieces, except for his manhood, as it was eaten by a fish. Here's an ancient wood Ka statue of death. So this picture that almost makes us always think of a Mary type of thing that goes on. This is Iset, Neptunes, and Horus. Iset them reassembled the body of her husband by binding it together with strips of linen, putting it all back together, really doing something that sounds like a Frankenstein idea. Aided by her sister Neptunes, another powerful magician, they gave Osiris the breath of life. This not only brought him back from the dead, but he also allowed him to recover his virility long enough to impregnate Iset, thus ensuring his succession before once again dying. Well, that ensured that Horus was born, and so on, but actually with him not actually recovering his member, they gave him a gold one. And in one of the versions of that tale, even, it talks about how she turns into a bird, like you see Isis turn into a bird, where she lit upon it. Later we see a god named Min, and he's got a erect phallus, if we'll say it that way, and in that fact he could have a bird land on it. There's one ancient tale that said that a bird built a nest on that up against his body, and that would have looked much more like somebody's pubic hair and so on. But let's get away from that concept. But dead, alive, came back to life. She made a Frankenstein back out of her husband out of pieces, and then wrote him one time or whatever. It actually comes across as a virgin birth, if you can take the idea out of the fact that he died before this ever happened. Of course, this has been echoed in a few different places with Semiramis, and that of course goes with Dumuzi and so on, and his rebirth and coming back to life. So it's not alone in it. In fact, we have a Jesus myth that has the same idea. So here's a piece of the Book of the Dead, and the ritual was used to bring Osiris back to life. Essentially depicts how he became the first mummy. It's why on the sarcophagus of kings we often find Iset and Neptunes, or Isis and Neptunes, represented as the magicians who restore life to the deceased. They're both over there on to the side of it here, and so you can kind of see them to the left of it. In some variations, you'll see the male part here on the far right being drawn more in red ochre, and usually when they're in action, as if somebody was a worker and so on, that goes on. But also in the same text of the Book of the Dead, a lot of times you see them lighter. Women in their iconography are always drawn lighter. Men quite often are done in red ochre. That comes way back from even caveman art and so on, where the men were out doing a lot of the work and farming and so on, becoming a redneck, if you will, and the women didn't have to necessarily so much and stayed more interior, and we tried to keep them more fair and so on. Of course, you can see Osiris here in his bowling pin hat, and he's green. It's not easy being green. People have said all kinds of things about that, but it's really a sign of the green of the earth and the rebirth and stuff that comes up out of that. And if I could take this down one more, you could probably see the whole thing. You can also see the guy on the right, and he's giving an offering to Horus, or Horokti, Ra Horokti. But that's a pipe. There's also a libation being poured out here on the table and so on. This is part of the Book of the Dead. You see Osiris is there up on that little platform, and that's because he's a statue. He's dead. Versus the others. Notice they're all stepping forward with their foot just a little bit. Women a little less than men. But Osiris is not making that step. He's a station. So we're going to do a little magic traveling to the land of the dead and the necropolis and where the Egyptian bodies are being mummified at, and take a look at it on a tour. Okay, here we are, surrounded by it. As we go to each one of these stations, they will show something to us. So here are those statues and the coffin, if you will, where these coffins are. You can see this one's gold plated on the face. We'll take a look at some of those others later. And that's a famous one of the more Roman periods, where they started putting a face on a piece of wood, trying to resemble the person that used to be inside there and wrapping around it and so on. And they had a lot of the cartography type of cartonnage drawings, not just around the chest, which you even see in Touch Time and so on, but they started trying to carry it all the way down the whole body in an extra cocoon layer, if you will. So as we follow the line through here, we're going to see them making some of these mummies here and what they would have looked like. So the first thing they did was they sat and they cleaned them up real good. Yeah, purifying oils and so on that they used. The first step was cleaning. Once bodies arrived at the mummification site, they're placed on an inclined tables while the body fluids were drained away. They were then cleaned by priests until they were deemed ready for the purification process. So once that happened, the purification of the body began with a libation of sacred water, and the priest then fumigated the body with terebinth resin. So already they started a desiccation process with this a little bit, and a sealing of the body somewhat, and a good smelling type of resin, if you will, even before decay really even begins. After the ritual cleansing, priests use oils, spices, and all kinds of essences to further purify the body of the deceased. Finally, all the body hair was meticulously removed, so they're all clean shaven. One odd thing about that is they do continue to grow like facial hair and so on, and there are some mummies that have been shown to have a little bit of beard stubble, like a one-day-old beard and so on. It's because they still have facial hair continues to grow. So as we look at this, over time, after they put them through the Natron, they'll become a lot darker and start looking like beef jerky. But that's a different point of it here. So once they get them to this point, they actually open up their body and they start taking out some of the insides of a person. Once the body was properly purified, embalmers removed the organs following very specific procedures. First, the brain was extracted through inserting a spoon through the nostril to break the ethmoid bone. This is way back in your nose, in between that and your cavity that holds your brain. Then, using a spatula, the pieces of the brain were removed as thoroughly as possible. What remained was extracted out of a process of liquefaction achieved through the use of a caustic liquid. Then the cranial box, once emptied, was rinsed and disinfected with palm wine and poured inside the cranial cavity, and then stuffed with strips of linen cloth and then again liquefied resins here. If you look here, they are showing you some of the little collectives that they would have had on it. People in modern days are probably real familiar with ace bandages. Something if you ever pull your, hurt your wrist or your ankles, or especially a lot of times they're used for, or knees. And this is the same type of bandage, and that's what a mummy's really made out of. And if you think somebody's not good at flint knapping and stuff, by this time they were so good they were making these giant ginsu things out of it. And this would have been wrapped and then have some bitumen around it too, and then another layer, and had a good handle type part onto it, but still cut in here. And then they have metal objects, which we'll show you in a minute. One of the metal objects here is this hook, and that was used to take out the brain. So, looking on this, they basically would reach inside there and try to break the inside of it out. And once they did, they would start pulling out the brain. A lot of people believe now that they would take and set them off the end of the table and they would drain it out the bottom way rather than trying to pick it out the top and let gravity work its effects. But after taking care of the brain, embalmers made an incision on the left flank and carefully set aside the viscera. The inside of the body was also rinsed with this palm wine, and then the embalmers filled the belly with pure myrrh, cinnamon, and other perfumes and sewed it shut. In fact, whenever you go to the museums and stuff, and when you get around them, you might be able to get a hint of it. But if anybody ever opened up one of those sealed cases, every time they do, people talk about it. Wow, you can kind of smell it's all frankincense and myrrh and stuff. Yeah. The removed viscera were then washed in palm wine and packed in crushed herbs before being placed in canoptic jars. A lot of times they were ended up running through a natron process to desiccate them out too. And if we're to look here at this knife, it's pretty cute. Show you a bunch of decorations on it, but this knife also has Anubis' symbol on it, so see how this is going with rituals. This is from a tomb of Mnemosyne. It's his embalming knife, Anubis figure, New Kingdom era, and would have been used for quite a few people. It's a little gory here, but hey, at least it's just a 3D cartoon, right, people? So going through this idea and passing through, now you see I'm passing through that thing. One thing that they talk about here is that it's always done in a tent. And while there's some linens out there, they talked about a double guided tent. So basically it would be a tent inside of a tent that they would use. And sometimes whenever you first come into it would be a little entrance that's really a tent where you go in the front and then go out the back into the first tent, into the second. So like a triple. And this was supposed to keep flies and everything at that out. And they had this gossamer fabric like you see in the background that you can actually see totally through. That's really like that gauze, just not as thick as the ace bandages. And in that effect, still had some wind blowing through there, but didn't get sand in there, or especially flies, and start having problems with that and so on. So here we see the canoptic jars that we're talking about, and there's different ones that go with it, and then there's an arc chest that's over here that even has the poles going through it. They're not long, but that's the same arc concept. But this is the Canopic Box of King Sebin. This is 1628 BC or so, and the Canoptic Jars were each made in there and set inside. And if you look at the rim here on it, they have these wedges that are pretty much those biscuits that help hold boards all together with some rope and then a little bit of bitumen, and they've got the whole giant boat going. So when you redo these, if you wet these and then you put them in there and boom, it's not supposed to be opened very easily ever again. Kind of that hermetic sealing down concept. But canoptic jars were placed close to the sarcophagus or kept in a chest right nearby. Different times in the dynasties, they would have it on a little shelf that's over here. Sometimes they had their own little box with it right next to them, and so on. At first, the viscera were wrapped in tissue and placed in the vases. As the ritual requirements became more elaborate, ointments, spices, and even water and natron were added to the process I was talking about. So that's pretty cool. But if we go farther with it here, you can see another one getting worked on, and at another level here, you can see the canoptic jars after they've been used, and we'll show them here. This is the canoptic jars of Jed Konsa Ankh. So it has to do with Jed, which I did a video about, and Khonsu and the Ankh, which means life. And you can see sitting there in front of him, going through the ritual and the end part of it here, because he's ready to be natroned. And if we look at these, towards the middle of the New Kingdom, canoptic jars assumed the appearance of the 4 sons of Horus. They're known as protectors of the viscera. These protectors had their own guardians. Each was a goddess of the dead. Mseti, the human-headed god, protected the liver and was protected by the goddess Iset. Happy, the baboon-headed god, protected by the lungs, or protected the lungs, and he was protected by the goddess Neptunes that we talked about. Duamatef, the jackal-headed god, looks kind of like Anubis there, protected the stomach and was protected the goddess Neith. Of course, all these are important parts of the body. The heart was still left in. And finally, Knebsenef is the falcon-headed god, not Horus, as people thought, and he protected the intestines and was protected by the goddess Selket. So let's see if we can get a full look at them here. Some are more fancy than others. Some have been made out of clear alabaster and things like that. Pretty cool. So, and some of his funerary items are already there with him too. And they start preparing those points in the house. And what is the funerary? And now this is Natron. They're going to take him from that last point and put him in there, or basically if he has that tray around him like this, then they'll take and dig it all out to the sides, set him down in it, and then cover him up with the natron here. And it's a process that basically lasts 40 days. And it's kind of sacred in the Bible too, and that's why it has a whole repetitive motif of this 40 days concept, or one of the major regions. But here's a place where they get it at. This is the inner crater of Mount Emmy, Kosai, and Tibetsi, where it's in Chad today. It's a natural natron lake bed, and this is one of the places they get it. It's a naturally occurring mineral found in evaporite, and it's when salt evaporates, but this is a little strong in calcium carbonate, and it's actually used in like taxidermy and things like that. And of course that's kind of what we're doing, and you can tell whenever you taxidermy something, it keeps it as good as it can keep. This is that effect too. So they're generally mined from lake beds in Egypt, places like that. So now let's go on, and here we're looking at them covering the body with natron. They finish off the packing of the inside and so on with their filler that goes up, and of course it wouldn't have been somebody that looked like that doing the job, by the way, but I think they wanted to be ethnically ambiguous here, because they put somebody that looks like this, calling it a Egyptian noble, and then they keep having people like this, which is not correct for the period, and not even really correct for now, so I don't understand. If you're into it much, you'll know about it. Red ochre symbology is something that's a little known from people around the whole Mediterranean. So then they start to put wigs on the guy and stuff like that, and make fancy wigs for him. Once the body is fully desiccated by the natron treatment, the embalmers oil painted and sometimes even added hair extensions or a wig. They often used henna-based antiseptic preparation to give the body a more colorful and lively appearance while preparing it to resist molds and fungus too. That's kind of what it's really for whenever they do that, and give an extra coating, but it's already been cooked into beef jerky and then shellacked, so then they tried to get back a little bit more natural color over the henna. Here's also a wig that's been soaked over double in henna where it looks like, but they're all made of Caucasian hair. Interesting fact, you can go to Wiki under hair and see that types of hair have been reclassified recently by Oprah Winfrey's barber. But if you look just under curly hair, which is down a ways because they talk about all kinds of things, once you get there, you'll see a blonde haired wig, but they tell you it's not the wig, that's a scalp with the real hair on it. And when they found it, it was up under a black wig. So that'll show you where a lot of that concept comes from. So, moving right along, because we've still got quite a few stations to go here, running through Overshooting Our Destiny. And, oh well, I've gone the wrong way. And where I need to go is right here. Because after they wrap them, and in a more modern time, you've seen this in a lot of depictions where they have almost a reddish or red ochre stained wrapping that does a last wrapping and coiling around him, even though it's double cocooned in the first place, right? So, where am I getting? 39 minutes. I better hurry up. So, here also they have amulets that go with mummies and stuff that are here. In addition to the jewelry and amulets arranged on the skin of the deceased, amulets were also carefully inserted into the weaving and putting on of the different layers of the fabric and the weaving of linen strips. Each amulet was linked to a myth or an ideological belief related to rebirth. I recently did a whole decent-sized video on Scarabs, showing the scarab beetle and the fact that you can find a whole ideal of like Jesus and rebirth and the concept of it and the scarab beetle, and showing you where they had that, but also how they cheated a little bit in this game of going to death, because the scarab was, well, they actually used to took a little micro scarab and put it in his ear, and they did this whole ritual with it and taught the beetle that. And so even if you forgot, even though you had a book of life that was basically like a comic book telling you what to do, that you would have gone over a lot of times too, but even if you forgot and did all that and anything else failed, the scarab beetle was going to whisper in your ear the secret answers. So here's some pretty neat objects, but the funny thing is out of none of these they show a scarab, although that was a bunch of scarabs on the table here we were looking at. So, many ways trying to find rebirth, if you will, and then again masks. And this doesn't quite look at the level, of course, of King Tut. This is an interim type thing. Masks were an important part of the mummy's finery. Early wooden funerary coverings were very expensive. Of course, having to import the wood and everything, and they're basically taking a whole tree and hollowing it out. However, they soon were replaced by masks created by a technique known as cartonnage. It's basically like paper mache. Masks fashioned with this method were created by laying several layers of linen or papyrus pulp on a base made of mud or straw, and cartonnage was used for more than funerary masks. Ornaments and the animal coffins of late period were also used in such a fashion, and people started actually mummifying their animals to go with them and so on. So here you can see a gold gilded, where they just basically take gold foil and put it over a certain part, and that's of course to another level of that idea. So here's the mummy of Pakri, And so he's in a late period type mummy. And eventually, at this point, cartonnage developed of, instead of just having this whole cowling that slid over here that was all connected to one, you can see that this head is just a representative. There's this mummified head there next to it, kind of covered up. But they used to have this cowling, and this used to involve the necklace and so on, and like on King Tut's, and you know that's a cowling type deal. Well, it used to go down to about here, and now they've made that into a whole outfit here. That's about the 22nd dynasty that happens. Tut's back at 18, so it's not quite the same. Mummies were placed on a board inside a rigid envelope of cartonnage, which was laced at the back with strings, and extremely cost-effective and visually pleasing. And this technique was very popular through all the layers of society, other than the kings, of course, at the time. And this is a male, and you can see what that looks like at the time. Of course, this is Packery during the late period, and people try to say things, but we've looked at Ginger, the pre-dynastic mummy, so that concept kind of gets left in the Wayback Machine. What else do we have here? Oh, let me see. I need to go through here, and they have all these rituals that they end up putting on the sarcophagus. In fact, cartonnage envelopes were usually covered with inscriptions all over it, and it got to the point where it was just gaudy with how much stuff they put on it, and inscriptions and so on, colorations. But they all depicted daily life and decoration specific to the funerary world, and this was a true gift for Egyptologists eager to study the funerary rites of the ancient Egyptians. That and the Book of the Dead, which is coming forth by day, actually, really helped out a lot. But people were still left in awe until they've got, of course, the Rosetta Stone, and then that allowed them to really understand what they were trying to say. So here you can see in full procession, and they have this idea of the opening of the mouth procession. Whenever they have it here, the deceased, let's try to take a look at that a little closer. It's showing it right here, and there's this little hook that he's using, and of course a lot of the plaster came off the wall. This is the tomb of Perry, 18th dynasty, so around the time of King Tut. But here are the funerary implements that go with that. So here we're looking at a funerary mask, and to take it from the regular feminine coloring that you look at here to a male coloring, they just rub it over with red ochre. To take it to a higher status, they gold foil it. But you can also see this is that hook of the opening of the mouth ceremony and so on that's going on. I'm hitting 45 minutes. If it ends on me, guys, I'm just going to let it go. But opening of the mouth ceremony is done right here. It's the last stage of long ritual, was the act of touching the mouth with the adzi, symbolically allow the breath of life to infuse in the inner body. Its performance was reserved for a very specific set of people. Certain priests who wore the mask of god Anubis, or close relative of the family, or the heir to the throne. And this that we're looking at here is probably his wife in mourning, if you will, and a close relative, and if not a priest or one and the same that's here. This is the Book of the Dead of the Papyrus of Nebked of the 18th dynasty again, so around the time of King Tut. And that completes our tour. Isn't that fantastic? So pretty neat here. If I can get stood back up and walk outside, you can see other bodies that they're preparing for it and so on, and wrapping in certain ways, and all this one needs is cartonnage, if you will. And so, yeah, here's ancient Egypt, and yeah, now I want to get out of the funeral parlor just like y'all do too. So let's just go over here someplace. Let's just come over here by the fire and think just for a moment. Let me know what y'all think downstairs. It's another teaching tool I can use here is this example of this 3D Egypt. That is a more in-depth idea on how they build mummies, or how a mummy was prepared. Peace.